So welcome back to this fourth week, and our theme for this week touches upon a very sensitive issue, the question of religion and secularism and its connection to peace building. Oftentimes one thinks about religion as a factor impeding reconciliation and dialogue, and this is certainly true if one thinks about the political uses of religion, whether from the settler movement, for example, or from the or considering the early stands of Hamas, which at the time, in its early stages, considered Palestine as a non-divisible pious endowment, a waqf, thus de facto hindering any possibility of compromise and certainly of territorial compromise. These statements, the ones that I've just made, certainly represent a simplification for a situation that is really much more diversified and complex in both groups. But I'm mentioning these two examples just as quotes somehow of how religion can be and can become a factor obstructing the construction of any form of dialogue. And this is if used in a key that merges together with politics and nationalism. Coherently with the rest of the course and with the idea informing this whole work that we're doing together, during this week we will look at the relationship between religion and peace building from three different angles. In the first place, we will look at some of the statements and views and articles and material of some prominent religious leaders, both Jewish and Muslims and Christian, discussing religious sources as a mean of dialogue and peace construction. Our main sources will not be the texts themselves, but I will look in the pages of the journal New Outlook, the journal that I presented a week ago or so in some slides. Here I will also insert a section or maybe another presentation of slides on probably the first interfaith large conference that took place in the 1950s and that involved spiritual and political leaders from the south bank of the Mediterranean, certainly not only Israelis and Palestinians, but Israelis and Palestinians too. And this conference took place in Florence, in Italy. There were four of these Florence Mediterranean colloquia that took place between 1954 and 1959, and that had been organized by the then Catholic mayor of Florence, Giorgio La Pira. Since then, a myriad of organizations for interfaith dialogue and of colloquia had taken place, and all of them addressed the question of coexistence between Jews, Muslims and Christians in the Middle East or in Europe, and certainly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was always part of those debates in those conferences. Now, you can understand that we will not be able to cover the whole production in this field, so we will just consider a few examples addressing this issue for Israeli-Palestinian relations. So this was our first point. Our second point this week, we're going to concentrate on peace-building activities of human rights activists from Israeli Jewish religious and traditional milieus. As most of the other cases that we have considered thus far, these groups have not received much or enough attention from either the Israelis or in the international media or in academia. But following the Six-Day War and the beginning of the Israeli military occupation on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, a certain number of Orthodox Israelis committed to peace and justice founded a Jewish religious peace movement called Oz V'Shalom, Strength and Peace. And their intention was clearly to demonstrate that religion and dialogue and peace building could indeed go together, and that the religious camp in Israel was not necessarily only made up of settlers and movements denying the human and political rights of the Palestinian population. Other religious movements of the first kind of peace-oriented religious movements were also established later in the 1990s, at the end, actually in the midst and at the end of the first Intifada. We will follow their whereabouts in one presentation. And finally, our third point, there is a third relevant aspect to be investigated in this area. And I'm referring to those organizations struggling for secularism in Israel And these are organizations which see the predominance of religion as a hindrance to peace building with Palestinians. This kind of associationism already saw the light in the 1960s, for example, with the Israeli League Against Religious Coercion, and later with other organizations. One worth mentioning is certainly the Israeli League for Human and Civil Rights. So altogether, this is a much less studied field than the previous ones and the ones that we will cover thus far and the ones that we will cover in the weeks that follow. But it's still a fascinating story to follow and learn about. So I invite you to follow me to the slides that I have prepared for you. Thank you very much.